So we have a couple more people are dialing in or logging on. All right, for those of you that just joined, we just said that we were going to give people 1 more minute, but we do want to be respectful of everyone's time and make sure we get started here. And again, if you just joined, please, when we get to the end of our presentation, if you'd like to submit a question over in the chat, please do. Or if you think of a question in advance, feel free to go ahead and put it in the chat.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Welcome. I'm so glad you could join us. We were just giving people a minute to get into the webinar, but I feel like we are at a pretty good number. Do you feel good, Shawn?
Yep, we can get started.
Well, welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for our 5 Things to Consider series. And this one is on when you're making a statement on racism. And just as a beginning point, I just wanted to give you a little context for Allyn Media. We're a public relations and public affairs and communication firm. We do crisis communications. We have a social justice practice that Shawn Williams, my colleague, leads, that we started in 2019. And we wanted to offer everyone an opportunity to talk about, we wanted to share some things we've learned as people are talking about racism and they're making statements. And I know Shawn's going to kick us off in a minute on that, but Allyn Media has been around since 1983, and we're based in Dallas, Texas, and we do a lot of messaging and statement writing for our clients, and that's where we're coming from. So.
And if everyone could put their computers on mute, please, that would be very helpful.
All right, Shawn, you want to start, and then I'll put up the first slide when you're ready.
All right, so I'm Shawn Williams, Vice President here at Allyn Media, also lead our social justice practice, and we are really thankful that everyone would join us to talk about this. This has been a very difficult couple of weeks for a lot of us. You know, for the last 14 years, I've worked on issues related to African Americans in the media, advocacy, but it feels like it all has come to a head here in the last couple of weeks since the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And for us here at Allyn Media, we've helped our clients work with my podcast host, Ryan Trimble, to make sure that we've gotten information out on our podcast. We actually started a series called Where Do We Go From Here, which was titled after the book by Dr. Martin Luther King. We fielded a lot of phone calls and questions here at Allyn Media. And like a lot of folks, I'm tired. I've, wondered, how we're going to keep going through. But what I do is I think about the people who didn't have the luxury of being tired and kept moving forward as they face issues of racism in our country. I think about my grandfather who served in World War I in 1917 and came back to a country where he couldn't even fully participate in the freedoms that he was fighting for. I think about my grandmother who didn't want to move to Paris, Texas, our hometown, because 15 years before she was born, in our hometown of Paris, an African-American man, a black man, was burned alive as he was lynched in the fairgrounds at the city, and 10,000 people came out to watch. I think about the people in Montgomery, Alabama, who for 381 days, they walked to work or Ubered for back in the day in Montgomery during the Montgomery bus boycott. And I think about the families of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. So we have to keep moving, and this is an opportunity for us to come together and do all that we can do. So I want to say Thank you to those who joined us, and we all can do what we can do. So we'll look at our first slide. For us, this seminar specifically, we wanted to focus on race and racism, specifically on racism. And you see a definition here that I got from lexico.com. And this is what the seminar is about for us. It's about racism. And I looked at a definition on Merriam-Webster. And amazingly enough, one of the questions I've gotten a lot is, what can I do? What can one person do on such a huge issue related to racism? But Kennedy Mitchum looked at the definition of racism at Merriam-Webster, and she thought it was inadequate. And if you look at that definition, you will see that it is inadequate. And she emailed the company and told them that she thought that they could do better. And they emailed her back, and they went back and forth. And they are changing their definition of racism based on her outreach and advocacy. So one person can make a difference. And that's part of what we want to talk about here today, is how even crafting statements, we're going to look back over the last couple of weeks and even going forward, because even the last couple of days, we'll talk about companies who've had to, and organizations who've had to release statements related to racism. It's something that still has to be top of mind. So the first thing we want to consider, we'll go to our next slide, is how we got here. And it's very important, as you are looking at crafting statements, as you're looking at making responses related to racism, that you understand how our country got to this moment, how from 1619, when the first Africans were brought here as enslaved people here in what became the United States, all the way up to until today, how we got here. And we've seen protesters, we've seen a really antagonistic relationship between the African-American community and the police, which stretches back many, many, many years. And that relationship is based on the very foundation of policing in America. Chief Renee Hall, the police chief here in Dallas, she's mentioned on a couple of occasions that I've heard how policing has its origins in the slave patrol. And that was when armed white men were in charge of making sure of controlling the movements and the lives, making sure to exact discipline on African Americans. And so that is something that is basically part of the foundation of our policing system here in the United States. And that still is evident in today by this kind of antagonistic relationship that you see between the police and African Americans. We have some pictures here, one being the black and white of Emmett Till, kind of middle on the left. And, a lot of times we look at these incidents as historical, which they are, and it looks something further back. But I know for me, from my personal experience, when I think about Emmett Till, who was lynched in Money, Mississippi, when he was 14 years old, while he was from Chicago, I think about going on walks with my grandmother back in the late 70s and early 80s. And we would go on walks, or if we would go to a store, if I was whistling, she would say, a boy got killed in Mississippi for whistling at a white one. And I would think that, that seems so long ago, there's no way that is even relevant to today. But it is how close and proximate that the history is that feels so far away. And now we're seeing a lot of things that are repeated. So I would ask everyone to go out, and the first thing to do would just look at history, study the riots that happened in the Red Summer in the around 1919 to 1921. Look at what happened at Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, when hundreds of Africans basically just for being prosperous. And so we want to make sure that we know how we got here. And again, even with our most recent incidents, it's important to know what happened to Breonna Taylor, know what happened to Ahmaud Arbery, obviously know what happened to George Floyd, and even locally, Jordan Edwards, Botham Jean, Tatiana Jefferson, know why people are protesting, why people are upset. So we'll go to our next slide. And the second thing that we wanted people to understand is that courage is being rewarded, especially in these statements. And the statement that you see here was released very early by the Chicago Bears and their chairman, George McCaskey. And we see two things that are consistent in what we've seen as effective statements that have been released by organizations. And we see it here in this statement, and you'll see it in others that we list in our resources. And if you have questions as we're going, we are going to take questions through the chat, and we'll answer those. And then any questions that we don't get to, we will answer those on our resource page. But the two things that we see in the statements that we've seen to be effective, number one, either they mention by name the individuals who have been victims of recent violence, and most notably, you will see George Floyd, you will see Breonna Taylor, and you will see Ahmaud Arbery listed in most of the statements, the effective statements. But in this statement by the Chicago Bears, while they didn't list by name up here, you see that they talked about the fact that there was an African-American man, and it talks about that person dying at the hands of officers. So the second thing that these effective statements have done is that they've mentioned that either that they died at the hands of police or that they died at the hands of someone who was white. They mentioned the race of the person who perpetrated the violent act against them. And so, there are a lot of statements that have been released that have a lot of words, a lot of buzzwords. They talk about race, they talk about healing, they talk about diversity. But when it relates to why people are marching in the streets, why there has been unrest, and why we've seen the sustained effort, it's specifically related to racism, and it's related to how African Americans feel that they've been treated by law enforcement, and how we've expanded, seeing people expand that to the workplace, racism in the workplace, healthcare disparities, and as we've seen with COVID-19. So again, the effective statements have had these two things in common. They mentioned the race of the person who died or their name, and they have mentioned the race of the person who committed the violence or listed that they were part of law enforcement if they were. So we have another statement that was not as effective that we'll see on our next slide. And this slide, or this statement was released by the New York Knicks, James Dolan. A couple of things about this statement. Number one, it was late. While other organizations in sports were releasing statements, they waited a long time, which wasn't unexpected necessarily by people who followed the Knicks. But when they did release a statement, it's what you see here. And it talks about equal society, no racism, bigotry, no violence or hate. And that's something I think it really is the bare minimum, because that's something that we could have released that statement a month ago, 2 months ago, and we could all look at that and agree with it and not know it's not even time specific. So I think the effective statements are speaking to the times that we're in, and even moving forward, they will be relevant and timely, those statements. The next slide and the next takeaway is having diverse voices as part of making these statements, putting together the statements, putting together responses. I think the tendency is to release a statement that is just related to your current customers. And so a lot of folks are accustomed to addressing their current customers. They're accustomed to making communications that they will feel comfortable with. But yet these statements are not just directed to your current customer base in many cases. These statements are being seen by people who may have followed you on the fringe. They may have had a problem with you. They may be waiting to see whether or not you will take that courageous step. And so it's important in a lot of cases to have an outside voice. For instance, since we're talking about racism, we're talking about racism related to African Americans, you would want to have someone African American to look at your statement, to look at your response. And it may not just be the one person or two people or three people or however many people that work in your firm. You may need to, or your organization, you may need to solicit people who are outside of your firm, outside of your comfort zone, to help you. Because a couple of things they may tell you, like I told a friend of mine when they showed me a statement, and I guess they probably caught me on a bad day because I said, if you release this statement, I will personally make it my mission to go against this statement and talk about why it's so bad. And then you might have someone to say, "Ooh, man, this is good, but for where you are right now, where your organization is, this might not be the time to go quite to that level. So you might want to even it out." I mean, and again, take multiple opinions because, you know, again, one African-American voice does not represent everyone. So it's good to have more people and more voices involved in the decision. So I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer to talk about two more things we should consider.
So the two things that I was going to talk about are context and content. And if you had been following Ben and Jerry's ice cream company, you would know that 4 years ago, they were very vocal with the words that they chose in their communication. They announced that they were going to support Black Lives Matter and that they were going to take actions to do that. And then if you saw this statement a couple of weeks ago, and we have a link to the full statement on our website with our resource page. But if you saw this full statement, not only does it name a lot of people's names, and it goes deeper, as Shawn's comments did earlier, it also talks about 4 calls to action that company has. And it's consistent with their mission and their principles. So the context of what's going on in the world is there. It's very relevant, like as Shawn was saying, with the contrast with what the Knicks put out. And then the content of it is very specific. There's not a lot of vague language. It's really clear what they're trying to do. If you are a member of a Dallas area YMCA, you received an email like this. The Y did the same thing. Again, thinking about context and content. When you read this message, it's clear that the context is the moment that we're in. Just like the Ben and Jerry's message, it was very relevant to the moment that we're in. But the content is appropriate for the YMCA and where it is, and it ties directly back to its mission. You see that language. We work diligently every day to be a cause-driven organization that supports youth development, healthy living, and social responsibility. And then they go on, again, they talk about Mr. Floyd, they talk about social inequity and what the Y stands for. So again, there's the context of what's going on in the world, but it's tied very tightly to their specific mission. In contrast, I'm going to show you something that Laguna College of Art and Design posted. So they made a post and it used some of that vague language that Shawn talked about. It doesn't mean it's not important language, but it's just not in the context of the moment that we're in. As Shawn said about the Knicks, these are good things. They're just not contextually relevant. And then it was also tagged with All Lives Matter. And then people started to comment about that. And instead of making a separate post, the school at first chose to just respond to it. And I say the school because even if you have one person on your staff who's responsible for social media, right? When you have blessed this person with the authority to go out into the world and make your comments, then they're speaking on behalf of your whole organization. And I know some places have said, oh, well, we didn't, that's not what we think. That's just what our person who's posting on social media thinks. And that's not an excuse, right? The social media is a sophisticated communication tool. And so you need to make sure that the person who is in charge of that has the message and the voice of the organization, back to Shawn's comment earlier about making sure you have diverse voices at the table. Laguna College of Art and Design responded, I think over 5 days later, with a post that was dedicated. And they made an interesting choice. I just want to take a minute, since we are a design firm also, when we're talking about communications is visual, but it's also the words that matter. And when we think about social media, we all think very visually, right? People love videos, they love photos. And generally, people like myself and Shawn are pushing you for fewer words in your post. But in this moment, uh, I think that it's possible that a lot of things get lost in the comments, right? There's some very effective language there, but all I see with my eyes when I scan over this post is we hear you, we're listening, we'll improve. If I wasn't already personally invested in an apology, I might miss all the good stuff. So just as we're thinking about those words that matter so much, as Shawn pointed out, we also feel like the way you display those words matters. And in this situation, having more copy like the Bears used, or having more copy like Ben and Jerry's used, or more copy like the YMCA of Dallas used, was very important because it was a issue that demanded those words and that communication, and that was successful, right? Because clear communication is successful communication. So you're probably familiar with Mr. Breeze. And while it is known that he has done a lot of good things for the city of New Orleans, and while we understand that the city of New Orleans is over 60% African American or Black identifying, one of the things that Mr. Breeze forgot was context. Remember, I'm talking about context and content. And to Shawn's earlier point, you could read what he said here, and it's very personal. It's about his personal experience and his grandfathers, right? But the moment we were in isn't about Drew Brees's grandfathers. It's about something bigger. And so we're missing the context. And it's back to what Shawn said again about the Knicks. This statement could have been 3 years ago. It could have been today. And so when we come back and we see him post not one, but two apologies, one was in writing with some very specific language and some calls to action. And then one was in video. And his colleagues, as we all know, his colleagues got in there and had that conversation with him. But you'll see that language really pivoted to be contextually relevant. And then Shawn, I'll turn it back over to you.
So we went through our 5 things that we wanted you to consider. And then we also want to leave you with some takeaways just to make sure. And then again, if you have any questions, feel free to put those in chat. We have a couple that we already received that we're going to start with. But number 1, be mindful of the big picture. This is, the reason that this has been such a sustained movement over such a long period of time is because this is 400 years in the making. And so any statement that you make, any portion of this conversation that you decide to be a part of, you have all of that history that you should consider. And even if we have people who've joined us from outside of Dallas, but we know a lot of our friends from Dallas and North Texas are here. Also be aware of the history of Dallas. Also understand what has happened here. When we were sharing some resources, one of the resources that we are sharing is a PBS segment on lynching in America. And there was a lynching here in Dallas on Main Street, right downtown, that is part of this city's history. And the city even today is working on how to memorialize that, how to contextualize that. That's something that if you decide to have a conversation on race, and as race relates to this city and the difference between North and South, you have to understand all that history. So we want to make sure that everyone is understanding of the big picture. Number 2, be intentional with your word choice. Words matter for us in this business, and for many of you who are PR professionals, you obviously know that words matter. And so it can make a huge difference as it relates to conversations around race and how people take things. I had a big Twitter argument the other day. Not that I try not to make it a habit of having Twitter arguments, but over the last couple of weeks, I've had a few, I have to admit. And someone tagged or put in their statement, "You people." Like, for instance, you people just aren't going to be satisfied with anything. You people are trying to make a big deal out of nothing. And I tagged and said, "You people" has racist connotations. It comes from a place of racism in the past when people used "you people" as a message of division. And this person wanted to talk about how that was not, but it does have racist connotations for people. And so it's important, to know those kinds of things, especially as you're communicating. What are the words And that's one thing that we are still working on here, is looking at what are the words that serve as triggers for a lot of times as it relates to racism. What are words that people use, and phrases that people use that they don't understand the history and historical context of. So be intentional with your word choice. Be mission relevant. We saw that in the statement from the Y. And we work with a number of educational organizations here, and some of, thinking about what can we do as an organization. But if you're an education organization, one of the biggest systems of racial oppression and racial inequality is the education system. So you can talk about what is it that your organization is doing as it relates to to closing the gaps as it relates to racial inequality or educational attainment inequality that is specific to the mission of that organization. And many of us, for us, we're a communications firm. And so, we have used the resources that we've had to do a seminar like this. We've used our resources to have a podcast series. So what you can do towards your mission to help in this time is very important. Be specific about the actions you will take. Some of the statements that we've looked at over the last couple of weeks, we are committed to having continued conversations. We are committed to making sure that everyone is treated equal. We are committed to making sure our voices are heard, which are all important things. But again, if you look at the statement by Ben and Jerry's, you will see that they have specific things that they plan to do to dismantle what they refer to as white supremacy. And so the more specific, the better. We also have put a statement in the resource section. We got a email from Airbnb yesterday. And Airbnb has long been accused, and people have talked to them about discriminatory practices by their hosts for their Airbnbs. And they sent out a statement that they are still working, and they are creating a tool that will help to identify if hosts or people are being discriminatory. And they worked with change.org in order to put that, our Color of Change, in order to put that tool together. And they say that they want to share that tool with other organizations to help them try to identify and weed out racism and discrimination. I think it's called Lighthouse is the name of that tool. But again, it's very specific. And then the last thing that we would like to say is to be ready to listen. Especially for those of you who have African American employees in your company, for your African American clients and customers, this is a time to listen and better understand. And I think there is a quick reaction that a lot of people have, especially if they feel like they have been an advocate, if they feel like they have been against oppression, against racism. And one of the things we talked about here in the firm is, and then we'll get ready to move towards our questions. But one of the things that we've heard a lot is people feeling that they are being accused of being racist. And that is not something that anybody wants to hear, is that they are racist. And in most cases, the person is not racist. But that does not mean that they cannot have unconscious bias, which there's a lot of training around in law enforcement. That does not mean that they cannot have actions that are against unintended consequences that are racial in nature. And so I think it's important to not think that just because someone questions something that you say or questions an action that you think that means that someone is saying that you are racist. It is generally saying that maybe something that is related to race that needs to be discussed. And so that is all for our presentation, but I think we're going to move to our question and answer period. We're trying to keep this to about 45 minutes. Any questions that we're not able to get to, we plan on answering those in our resources. Jennifer, you want to take the first one?
Yes. Suzanne Kedron, who is on the chat or is on the call, sent some questions yesterday, and I promised her we could start with those. And there's two. Number one, who's the best person to author the statement? The main person, like the CEO or the managing partner, or the Chief of Diversity and Inclusion? And Shawn, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, we believe that the best person to author the statement is the CEO or managing partner. You know, if it really matters, it's important that the head of the organization, their voice is the one that is clearly heard. Leadership matters right now as it relates to where we are. We do, again, want to go back and say it's important to have diverse voices. So it's important in order to make sure that that statement, it should be a statement from the heart. It should be a statement that represents what the organization feels and their values. But also, if they talk to their diversity team, if they talk to maybe their African American resource group, that can be very helpful to make sure that they don't have any unintended consequences in any of the language that they use. We've seen that from some of our clients where they have a really thoughtful, personal message that they've put out from the top that they want to share. But again, a lot of cases, it may be very heartfelt for them, but it may not be relevant for this moment. And so they run it by some people who help them to do something a little different. So we think it's important, though, that that message comes from the top.
And the second question that we received in advance yesterday was, so now you've issued a statement, then what? And what's the follow-up path?
We are encouraging people to continue the conversations with their clients and with their customers. We are also asking them to get more information about what the problems and challenges are. We work with a group for Oak Cliff, and one of their stated missions is to combat systemic oppression in Oak Cliff, and that is in their mission. And so, as something like what has happened over the last 2.5 weeks in our country related to racism after the death of George Floyd happens, Oak Cliff is already on the ground, working on the 75216 zip code on issues related specifically to African Americans in many cases. And you know, they have the statistic on their website of what those are. But we think that organizations need to get a better understanding. And there are a lot of organizations and corporations that have made donations to African American causes, to Black Lives Matter, and those things are very important. But we think it's important to communicate to your customers and clients exactly the things that you plan to do, how you plan to get involved, and find organizations that can help you and your company better understand why these challenges are going. And that also goes, I have to say, that also goes with law enforcement. I worked at Dallas Police Department for almost 4 years. They have a great community outreach organization. Learn more about what they are doing. What is the Dallas Police Department doing in order to try to make sure that these connections and relationships are getting better?
There's a great question in the chat from Terry Pierce to everyone. Is it too late to make a corporate statement now? And David Frederick, I have to recognize you, Chief Marketing Officer of the Dallas Y, says, I believe corporate statements made now need to include action or points of steps that will be taken. A statement without seems a little, you know, what David has said, too late. And Shawn, do you have some thoughts on that too?
Yeah, I agree with that. But, you know, things are continuing to happen. And so part of the reason why we think it's important to think about this is because the situations are changing. If you saw what happened with Oklahoma State, for instance, on yesterday, their coach Mike Gundy had on a shirt that one of their players did not agree with. And the player went on and started to tweet about that. And then other former players who played at Oklahoma State talked about that. And then the university had to release a statement. And so, you know, the time for making a generic statement about how an organization feels about racism or feels about the death of George Floyd, absolutely too late for that. But there are still opportunities for people to give updates. And it is an opportunity because things are changing every day. And like I did just reference what happened with Airbnb. And so, you know, I think that if organizations want to make their voices known about what they plan to do to combat racism, I think that they can still do that, but it should be mission relevant. It should be specific.
That's a great point. And I know John Altshuler has said, is it ever too late to be against racism? And I guess, in response to that question, I think, Shawn, you put some good context around it, and that being relevant again in the moments as they change, and making sure, I think that this is an ongoing conversation, right? Because that's what we want. We don't want a flash in the pan. If people are at a moment where they recognize there's an opportunity to do something different, something better, then sharing, it might be sharing your plans about how you're going to do something different, something better. Even if it's, if it's not the biggest step in the world, it might be a good step for you. And sitting together with that employee resource group or that committee and talking about what are those steps that we feel comfortable talking about shows an effort. And I think too, what I've witnessed with clients, and Shawn, I'm interested to hear how you feel about this, is that sometimes that first step, people are nervous or they're so motivated, but they were so motivated in the moment to participate in the conversation that then it gets a lot easier as they move forward. Shawn, have you seen something like that, or the opposite?
No, I agree. I think, there are a number of clients that we work with who just had not taken a step like this before, and it was very difficult for them. But to John's point, we should all be against racism, which is why, we have focused so much on this. And then, people will then try to pull back layers of what that means and whether or not this is racist or that's racist. But what we've seen and what people are upset about is the disparities that are based on race. And if it's related to sentencing disparities, if it's race based on the income or wealth gap, if it's education, we see disparities based on race. And so what we're asking people, and suggesting to people is that they recognize that these things exist. This is racism. It is racism within some of the systems in our country. And we need to all talk about how we can fix that and what are the specific actions that we can all take to fix that. Again, to go back to the example of the Webster Dictionary, seems small, but that's one thing that one person can do. And, we all need to do our part, but it's not the time to just list all, like, the Drew Brees example, to list all of the things that you've done. It's really not about that. It's really a much more intentional conversation, and to figure out for a lot of people how they can make a difference, they need to do a lot more of this thing.
So another question is from Steve Lovelace, and he's asking, should we mention George Floyd by name now, or is it enough to allude to him like the Chicago Bears did in the example?
So one thing about the Bears example is because they came out early with their statement, it works a little bit better because what we've recommended to our clients is that they do name the names of individuals, especially George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery. But in a lot of cases, because we are in Dallas, you have Jordan Edwards, who was killed in Box Springs, and Tatiana Jefferson in Fort Worth, Botham Jean, all who died as a result of engagement with law enforcement. And so we believe that it is added benefit to the statement, and it gives it much more power if the names are mentioned. But I think that if you mention African American, how African Americans have been treated, disparities with African Americans, that is much better than any kind of racial or any buzzwords. Again, as Jennifer said earlier, not that those words aren't important, but this moment is about racism that has happened toward the African American community that starts in 1619 when the first enslaved Africans were brought to this country, and this is what that moment is about. And so if you do name African American the way that the Bears did, but I think because they came out so early, and we have one of the resources we have is a look at other statements that other teams in the NFL made, and you can see how their statement differs from those. So I think that that's the difference for the Bears. But we've advised most of our clients if they say George Floyd or any of the other names to be specific by name.
We've had a couple of questions also about back on that similar question to Suzanne, what she originally asked about who signs that question. Could it be anonymous? And I know something we've talked a lot about internally was the fact that when the leader of the organization says something, it means the most. And it is when the head of the employee resource group, when the only voice in the room is the head of the employee resource group or the diversity, equity, and inclusion committee, if that's the only voice on the issue, that it takes away something, because it's back to that term that Shawn used earlier, saying you people. It's like, that's for you, but I'm the head of the organization and I don't have to say that. And so, Shawn, can you talk? I know we talked about this a little bit earlier today, but I think that's a question that's coming up again and again in the comments that I think might be important. And then another little add-on, what if you're a nonprofit and you've got a president and a CEO and you have a board chair? How important is it that all of that leadership is tied to your statement?
Yeah, we've seen statements that have had multiple signers as well. If it is the board chair and the president and CEO, that's a powerful statement. Again, I think the main thing that we want to see and we've advised is the leadership up top. And it does not mean that the employee resource group does not make their statement also, because they have a whole nother set of things that they want to talk about. And that group may be able to then petition to their own organization about wanting to make their workplace more diverse, about sensitivity training, all these things that will help make their experience better as they work. So we are not saying that those groups do not need to have statements or should not make statements. We're just saying if an organization is making an organization-wide statement and they plan to do that, we saw a really good statement from Dr. Woody at the Bridge, where he talked about how homelessness has specifically affected African Americans and the African American community, and the percentage, I believe, is 63. I get 63 and 68 mixed up, those two numbers. But I believe 63% of their population is African American, and specifically how African Americans have been dealing with homelessness. And the statement came from him. It was a very powerful statement. He's also followed that up with videos as well, messages. So I think that is our point, is that it's really important to have the discussion come from the top.
We have another question that Angela Broyles has shared with everyone. What do you think about the transparency movement where businesses post the racial makeup of their organization?
So I think that this is probably another topic for us, because I think that there are going to be so many tentacles to this conversation on racism, including transparency, because if you look at racial makeup of the organization, then you also will want to know what are the disparities between pay, how are people being paid as it relates to race, how is compensation totally related to race, how is discipline handled related to race, and so and I think all of that does fall under transparency. But it's important to, so I think these are the type of conversations and questions and concerns that we all need to continue to take forward, because while we're starting with statements today, that is literally just kind of the tip of the iceberg as it relates to how we can impact this. But we did want to talk about where we are in this moment, because like Oklahoma State found out, we're still in the moment.
Yeah.
We're at 45 minutes. Go ahead.
We've got we can take a few more minutes if anybody else wants to share another question, or you can come off mute and ask if you'd prefer to do that. One question that was asked was, will we get a copy of the presentation? So this, as you all saw when you logged in, is a recorded conversation. So we'll be sharing the webinar on our webpage under our action page. And so that way people can see the presentation and ask questions and be able to hear the content that went along with it. Well, thank you all so much. Be respectful of everybody's time. It's 1:45. Thank you all for coming and participating. Thank you, Shawn, for leading a wonderful conversation for our social justice practice, but also just for our firm in general. And thanks everybody who shared a question. And if you have a question later on, please don't be afraid to email or tweet, or go to our website. You can email us from there. We'd love to keep the conversation going. And I know Shawn's got and I have talked about where do we go from here with conversations, and please listen to the podcast. We have had some amazing guests thanks to Shawn and Ryan's hard work. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it.
Thank you.